Hi students! This is our first week together and I wanted to give you a heads up about how we're going to be progressing through this semester. And this class, we're not going to be memorizing dates. Instead, we'll be memorizing period styles. So the artworks will be known or recognized by their period style, like Renaissance. And we're going to start with the period just before the Renaissance. The word Renaissance, it's renaissance, meaning again, naissance, birth. So it literally translates to a rebirth. Now, the correct question to ask is a rebirth of what? A rebirth of ancient art. Now, some of you are panicking. You're like, I haven't taken an art history class before. What am I doing in this class? It's okay. That's what this lecture is going to be about. I'm going to get us all on the same level. So even if you've never taken an art history class before in your entire life, we are all going to start this week with the same base understanding. And that base understanding is going to be in the period just before the Renaissance, so that we can all walk into the Renaissance and progress through the semester together. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's get started then. We're going to start our understanding for this class in the Gothic period. Gothic? Yes. So the Gothic period starts around 1140 and it progresses through the 14th century. So it ends in the 1300s, right before the Renaissance. Exactly. The Gothic period is a period at the end of, let me move myself there. If we were to look at this in a timeline of Western art, there is the classical or antique world, and then there's the Renaissance. And the stuff between the classical world and the Renaissance is referred to as medieval. The medieval period of time is from around 500 to around 1400. The word medieval literally means the stuff in the middle, the Middle Age. Medi, middle, eval, age. We already know Renaissance, again, naissance, birth. And then antiquity. If I use that word, antiquity, antique, old, ity, reality. So the old reality or the old world, the middle stuff, and then a rebirth of, you guessed it, the old world. So if you haven't taken an art history class with me before, just a heads up, I love to use vocabulary terms and to break them down to help you better understand why we use them, how to use them, and then you can seem really smart outside of class when you're like, oh, you know what Renaissance really means? It means rebirth. So let's remember that. A Renaissance is, or the Renaissance is a rebirth of antiquity. Now for this class, we're going to start our look at the artwork just prior to the Renaissance so that we can see what they were ignoring and how they were looking back to the classical world. That period is the Gothic. So we're going to start our semester with the Gothic style. And the Gothic is the last period style at the end of the medieval era. If we think of the word Gothic, I don't want you to think of goths. I know. It's not pale skin and, a love for black. It's not the aesthetic or the lifestyle of the goths. Instead, I want you to understand the term Gothic came from before we get into the real word Gothic, if you want to know about how goths got the name goths, email me. I'd love to talk to you about it, geek out about the aesthetic of goth and how it came to be. But the word Gothic really came about during the Renaissance. when a Italian Renaissance artist and art historian, his name was Giorgio Vasari. And so Vasari was writing about his work and his friend's work. He was friends with a lot of famous Renaissance artists. And he was saying how different they were, how new and exciting they were, because they didn't look like the previous period, which he referred to as Gothic. And the word Goth, you see I've highlighted it here, Gothic. Goth meaning the Goths. Ik means like or after. It looks like the Goths. Well, who are the Goths? Again, not these guys. The Goths that Vasari is speaking about are a group of tribes called the Goths who way back during the Roman Empire in the classical antique world, the Goths were one of the many barbaric tribes who had invaded Rome, and many historians, including Vasari, thought of the Goths as one of the many problems that brought the downfall of the Roman Empire. Here, this is a map of what I'm talking about. So this is the Roman Empire, and you can see all these crazy lines. These are the lines of invading Germanic tribes. And the Goths and the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths are three of the major tribes that came through and wreaked havoc throughout the Roman Empire, and what many historians believe then to have been the downfall or aided in the downfall of the Roman Empire. So Vasari is saying those horrible Goths, those brutish Goths, they destroyed the classical world, and to then refer to the Gothic period as that stuff just before a Renaissance is Vasari's way of, well, being a snob. He's like, we are just as grand and great as the ancient Greek and ancient Romans, and the stuff that you guys were looking at before, that was so basic, so brutish, so Gothic. Got it? Mm-hmm. And that could not be farther from the truth. However, the term Gothic, it stuck. And so artists, art historians have continued to use the term Gothic to describe that period. And it was, originally, thanks to Vasari, a derogatory term, but now it's just become the normal term that we use for this period. You might be asking, well, what did they call themselves? They called themselves modern art. They called themselves opus modernum. It's Latin for modern art. Isn't that wonderful? Now, the Gothic period, in terms of what's happening at this time. Here, this is a map to help illustrate what's going on in Europe during the medieval period, or more specifically, at the end of the medieval period during the Gothic. All right, so we have some major kingdoms. The Kingdom of France, which now occupies what is now mostly modern-day France. And there is a territory referred to as the Norman Kingdom, or England. And for a time, through marriage, they did control a portion of the southern Italian peninsula. And then this large purple area is the Holy Roman Empire, which is made up of various duchies or dukes and barons and princes and a figurehead called the emperor. Now, I want you to be aware that what we know as the country of Italy did not exist. The Italian peninsula is there, but the country that we know as Italy did not exist until the 1840s. So for most of this class, when we're looking at Italy, we cannot think of this as a united country. Instead, the Italian peninsula is going to be broken up into various powerhouses of control. And so here we're looking at the upper portion controlled by the Holy Roman Empire, the southern by the Norman Kingdom, and then beyond that, I want you to recognize that for a time there is Muslim domination. There are Islamic kingdoms that have been set up in the Spanish Peninsula, or I should say the Iberian Peninsula. And as we progress through this class, we're going to see the Muslim forces pushed out of the peninsula and the settlement and establishment of the kingdoms of Spain and Portugal. I know, it's a lot. It's a lot. There's just a few more things of context before we get into the artworks. During the Gothic period, we see this amazing rise in international trade, an increase in long distance trade, because there's relative peace in Europe. What I mean by relative peace is like, you know, it's not like all crime is gone or anything like that. There's still going to be wars, but in general, there's enough peace and diplomacy to allow for these extremely long distance caravans and these ship routes to bring trade, to bring goods, raw materials in and around and out through the European, African, and Asian continent. So this image here is showing you some of the major land and sea routes that connect. Look at how we have these connections up through Northern Europe, down and around into North Africa and the Near East. This long black line is the route that the Italian merchant Marco Polo took, and he reached all the way to China. I show you this map of these trade routes because I want you to remember that these people are not isolated, that there is an connection, literal connections through routes, trade routes, roads, but also there is sharing of ideas, there is sharing of goods, raw materials like cinnamon and cloves from India are traveling up through the Near East and docking in Italy to be sold in Europe. Silk from China comes along this long route that we now call the Silk Road. So all of these luxury items, Persian rugs from Persia, right? The fine porcelain ware that we refer to as China, it came from China, and so that's why the word China for this fine porcelain ware is what we use. So we have these raw materials and expensive luxury items being imported, and we have ideas being shared in Europe and outside of Europe. So the medieval period is not a time of isolation or darkness. Instead, it is this rising or bubbling of connections, of communication. And it's because of that that we will get a Renaissance. So it all comes back. We need to understand what's happening just before the Renaissance to really appreciate the Renaissance. It is also during the Gothic period that we see a flourishing or a rise in population. We see a rise in population. During the Gothic period, there were advances in farming technique or farming technology, which led to an increase of food production. Now you might think, what does this have to do with art history? It connects, I promise you. Because there's more food, more people can eat. Happy people make lots of babies, and a rise in population happens. And so with these rises in population, we see clustering of people for jobs like merchants and clerics and record keepers, and they are all coming together in these cities. So we see a rise in cities, or the development of cities in Europe. And it's in these cities that we see that communication really thrive. It's during the Gothic period that we see the birth of the university system. So college, like what you're in right now. Some major colleges that started during the Gothic period include Cambridge, Oxford, a major university in Paris called the University of Paris starts. And so with these cities, they become intellectual hubs where people come together and share ideas and then disperse these ideas across the land. So the connection to art history is in the context of how these people were living and what they were experiencing. And we're going to now see that in the artworks. Does that make sense? So we're going to start our look in Italy. Now, as I said, let me move over here. Now, as I said, Italy does not become a united country until the 1840s. So until then, it's broken up into a lot of powerhouses. Here in this map, we're seeing a more detailed view of that. So the Kingdom of Naples is ruled by a king. These middle areas are ruled by the Pope, the Catholic leader of the church. He lives in Rome, and he controls this area not only religiously, but the physical country itself, so the papal states. We have some republics, meaning representative governments in Siena and Lucca and Florence, a duchy, like the Duchy of Ferrara, the Duchy of Modena. Duchy means it's ruled by a duke. A major republic in Italy is the Republic of Venice. Now, you might be familiar with the city of Venice, but for a time, they controlled major portions of land up and down the Adriatic Sea because the Venetians were major sea merchants. They traveled across the seas, across the Mediterranean, and brought back expensive and exotic goods. And so they controlled portions of land along their sea routes. I could go on and on and on about this, but I want us to get a quick setup of where we're going to be looking. We're going to go to this city here first, Orvieto. See you soon.